Welcome to IVF This, episode 115, The Inner Critic. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well today. Wanted to share a little bit about what's been going on for me personally and kind of what drove me to write this episode. So you may or may not have heard me talk about how I have ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was 20 or 21. It was actually what's called like an incidental finding. It wasn't something that anyone was looking for. Around that time, I was working for a neuropsychologist, and he specialized in psychological testing. I was finishing up my bachelor's in social work and I was doing an internship at that time as well. But while working in his office at this testing center, I was asked if I wanted to administer tests. And I agreed because it was, let's be honest, I was a broke college student. It was a pay raise. So I went through a generic battery of tests just so I could familiarize myself with the testing process and what it looks like and how it was. When I finished with the testing, the neuropsychologist evaluated it and he kind of casually said, "Hey, did you know you have ADD?" So, 20 years ago it was called ADD or ADHD. Now it's exclusively ADHD. And he found that I also, which is interesting, have a nonverbal processing disorder around like spatial reasoning, which sounds like a made up thing, or it did to me. But really what it means is that I can't manipulate objects in my mind like in a three-dimensional way. But since I'm not an engineer, an architect, nor a musician who has to read sheet music, it really wasn't a big deal to me. But the ADD, or now known ADHD, there's a profound effect. Now, when I look back, it was clear from my days in grade school how significant the ADHD has been in my life. And so I got some resources and I was really able to develop strong, what we call compensatory strategies and systems that can help me be successful without needing medication or therapy for that specifically, right? A very little known fact about ADHD in women is that it is very impactful on your hormones, right? So your hormones can actually exacerbate your ADHD symptoms. So it can be more difficult to manage your ADHD during your period or periods of hormonal fluctuation. It can be also very challenging during postpartum. And so with each of my children, my ADHD has gotten a bit more challenging to manage, culminating in this most recent postpartum period. My youngest is now 1 year old, and I just turned 39 over the last few weeks, and it has been, over the last several months, a Herculean effort to do a lot of things where they were almost effortless in the past, or at least it didn't require as much effort, attention, time, any mental capacity, things like that. So I have to go through another battery of testing because I can't locate my original tests in order for my new doctor, my primary care doctor, to prescribe me stimulant medication. I've tried some non-stimulants and we just don't have as much improvement as we would like. So here we are. Now, you all might be asking yourself, well, this is great information, but why the hell are you telling us? And that's a valid question. I'm glad you asked, because over the past few years, I have thought that maybe I had some depression, like clinical depression. And as I'm learning more and more about myself, that depression is really the result of my untreated ADHD, just running amok. And now knowing that I would have likely needed clinical or medicational intervention a long time ago, at least the last 2 years. So when I do not stick to a pretty strict routine of exercise, mindfulness, which for me is mostly a lot of journaling, then my depression kind of is like in the driver's seat. It takes over and we have to kind of slog our way back. And this is happening pretty much every month with the ebb and flow of my hormones. And so this is where the inner critic comes in, because when I am not sticking to my routine and that depression kicks in as a result of my untreated ADHD, the volume on my inner critic is full blast, like a deafening volume. So I think one of the interesting things that I've noticed about podcasting and about being a coach is that talking to a lot of IVFers is that when I get on the phone with people or when they meet me for the first time, or even sometimes I think that after we've been coaching for a while, they tend to think that maybe I'm not human or something like that. Like I don't have feelings, or I'm at a point where I maybe am beyond negative emotion, or I don't know, that I kind of, some people tend to maybe put me on this pedestal a little bit. And I just want to assure you that is not accurate. It's not true at all. It's not what I coach about either. I still have the same humanness that everybody else does. What coaching does is that it just helps you navigate your messy humanness better. And it helps you navigate all of those emotions better. And I got to tell you, friends, I got a lot of human messiness. I got a lot of big emotions. And so I'm not immune to being nervous or uncomfortable or depressed or anything like that. I feel all of those things. The difference is now I just know how to deal with them. And I know that when those emotions do show up, that I know how to coach myself through it, right? Not out of it. There's no getting out of it. I just know how to coach myself through it. So, which ultimately led me to write this episode. So for the last year or so, I've really been focusing on how to manage my inner critic. And I wanted to share kind of what I've learned and the process that I'm now using to help myself with that. Because I think not only is this an applicable topic for literally anyone that has a brain, because everyone who has a brain has an inner critic, because I think what happens that when we're in the middle of like IVF or we're going through a really stressful time, what happens is that time, that IVF or that huge transition in your life shines a giant spotlight on how you have functioned. And the way that you functioned before maybe not be applicable anymore. You may not be able to access that anymore. It may not be functional in any way for you now. And so the volume on your inner critic is probably going to be turned all the way up too. So I think this is going to be really beneficial. So I have 3 basic things that I want to teach you about dealing with your inner critic. I love teaching you these things because number 1, 3 is just an easy number for my brain to remember. So we're going to go with 3. I know I do 3s a lot, but it's a magic number for me. I don't know what to tell you. So the thing about the inner critic first is that most of us aren't aware that our inner critic isn't us. And that's like the most problematic piece of this. We just tend to believe the things that our inner critic says to us. Like it's been yapping at us for so long that we don't really know that what it says isn't true. We hear the insults and the limitations and the jabs and the you should have done better, you should have done it differently. You'll never be able to do that. What do you think you're doing? Who do you think you are? I told you so. What makes you think this time will be different? Like those sorts of things. Anything that sounds critical, anything that you wouldn't say to a friend, when we hear those things and we just think they're true. We just think they're making observations about us. That's when the inner critic is so problematic, because when we think it's us, we can't distinguish what it offers versus what we could believe about ourselves. So the first thing you know about how to deal with your inner critic is that you need to become aware that you have one, to be able to understand the voice that the inner critic speaks in and how to differentiate it from how you speak to you. Most of us have a version of that critical inner voice. And who even knows where it came from, right? It's probably an amalgamation of a lot of different things. It honestly doesn't really matter where it came from. We could spend a lot of time talking about the why it's there and what happened in your past and all of that. But I think it's just much less relevant and much less useful for you in the moment than just noticing that you have one. Sometimes you will hear me refer to this inner critic as the drunken asshole in your brain. I also really like the idea of thinking of your inner critic as your roommate, which is a concept I learned from Michael Singer, who wrote the book, The Untethered Soul, The Journey Beyond Itself. It's a fabulous book. I audibled it and I'm going to listen to it. I've listened to it already twice. I'm probably going to listen to it again at some point. It's really good. But one thing that he says in his book, and I'm going to quote him here because it deserves to be quoted, there's nothing more important to true growth than realizing you are not the voice of the mind. You are the one who hears it. I really want you to think about that. I'm going to read it again. There's nothing more important to true growth than realizing that you are not the voice of your mind. You are the one who hears it. So what he's saying is that the you that is you, the youest of all you, the true you, the you that isn't your body, the you that isn't your brain, the you that isn't your mind, the essence of you, the you that exists after death, whatever your beliefs are, that is you. But then there's the mind and the voice of the mind. That is words, patterns, that is habits, that is neural pathways. That is unconscious thinking, is who knows where it came from, right? And a whole lot of not useful put on repeats in your brain, which if we don't question, we think is us. Not. You are not the voice of your mind. You are the one who hears it. And what he also teaches is to kind of consider that the inner voice is like a roommate. And I've used that example before too, right? And I love it because it's like a roommate that you can't actually kick out of your brain. It's a roommate that you can't kick out of your house. It's just there. They're just there occupying space. And so if you just decide that the roommate is not a problem, right? It's not a problem for the roommate to be there. You can recognize that when the roommate is talking versus when it's you, you will have created an awareness around that inner critic, and you will be able to separate the you that is you from the critical voice. And that is the first step. That is awareness. For me, this usually comes in the form of like you're lazy or you're never going to be able to do what you want to do with your business. You're always yelling at your kids. You're such a terrible mom. You haven't lost any of your IVF and baby weight. You can't think straight. What's wrong with your brain that you can't focus, right? All of these things, these are just the inner critic's feedbacks now. The thoughts have morphed and changed over time depending on what was going on in my life. So that's why it took me a really long time to understand the awareness piece. And coincidentally, that's why it takes other people a long time to understand the awareness piece. Sometimes a question that I get related to this is, how do I tell the difference between an inner critic and like an inner knowing or an inner wisdom? What if the part of me that is wise is also the part of me that is a critic? Is there a difference? How can I tell? All of those questions, similar vein, and I get them a lot. And so what I want to offer you is that yes, there absolutely, it's 100% a difference between your inner critic and your inner wisdom. The inner critic will sound, like to me, it sounds urgent. The volume is louder. It's more shrill. It's more punitive. It's seeped in disdain. It's different for different people. Sometimes people actually do hear a voice in their head. Doesn't mean you're crazy, but some people's inner narrative typically sounds like a voice. Some people don't hear a voice. It might just be more of a thought that pops in their head. Regardless, the volume of the urgency of the inner critic will be louder, faster, more pressing. It will feel more serious. Kind of speak in a way that demands your attention and is harsh versus your inner wisdom or your inner knowing, which is slow and soft and calm. So again, we need to develop awareness first. We need to understand the critical voice, all of those nasty judgments, things that we would never say to other people, yet we hear them in our own mind. We need to become aware that that is not who we are. That is just the voice in our head. That is our inner critic, our roommate, the drunken asshole. There is a difference. So then secondly, I think it's super useful instead of waging a war with your inner critic, right? Creating some sort of adversarial relationship with it, to assume a positive intent from your inner critic, kind of meeting it with compassion so that you can understand. You don't want to shut them out or ignore them. You would want to be curious. You would want to be compassionate. You would want to be interested. And I think that that's so much more useful to respond to your inner critic with compassion and under the assumption that it is attempting in some way to help you or to keep you safe, that it has a positive intent to it. Maybe it's just part of your past experience that associates a particular risk with rejection, and it's trying to prevent you from taking risks so that you don't feel rejected again. It's trying to prevent you from setting that goal so that you won't be disappointed. And it just comes across in a very critical manner. Maybe it's the voice of someone in your life. I almost titled this episode Your Inner Mean Girl, but I decided that because for many of you, the inner critic doesn't necessarily sound like a female, I can make it sound like anything. Maybe it's the sound of your father. Maybe it's your grandparent. Maybe it's a teacher. Maybe it's your mother. I don't know. But I want you to think about this voice and assume that it has positive intention and that it's trying to keep you safe, and give it, just so you can recognize it, maybe a little bit of a character. Like, what is it? Who is it? You recognize it. You can even name it if you like. For me, it's a mashup of a lot of different people. Not like I can tell the difference if it's just one person over another person, but likely there are two elementary teachers, one that I had in 4th grade and one that I had in 5th grade. And I think that they decided early on that I was a difficult child, and so they responded to me accordingly. Another one is an old soccer coach that I had that was what I would consider like an early version of Jillian Michaels and would just yell at me and say objectively awful things to a child. Anyway, I want you to see that it's not necessarily just one thing or one person. It's often a combination of a lot of things. But I tried to meet this mashup. I've kind of affectionately named him Stanley. Stanley was a patient that I had in an emergency room I worked in a long, long time ago. It was at the very start of my social work career. He was kind of this very well-intentioned, older individual, but zero filter. Like if he had a thought, he said it. Zero gangway, no self-editing mechanism whatsoever. He was this little old rumpled guy with a bald head. And I remember him wearing this blue button-up short sleeve shirt and he kind of mismatched the buttons. So one part of his shirt was longer and one part of his shirt was crumpled up. I have no clue if that's how he really looked. Like that's just how I remember him. But it gives me a chuckle when I think about it because some of the things he would say, you would be like, Stanley, you can't say that to people. And he would, but he wasn't a menace. He wasn't trying to be mean. He was just didn't have a filter. And that's kind of what your brain does. And so I can just picture my inner critic and what he looks like or what they look like if that's the case for you. And it's just so valuable to do something like that because then it helps you in that moment go, for me, it's like, oh, Stanley, that's just Stanley, whatever. We love you, Stanley. You're crazy. You're silly. You say things and that's just what you do, right? He sits on the couch and he smokes cigarettes and he tells me I'm messing up his life. It's fine. He's just trying to keep me safe, right? He thinks that this is just, his way is just the right way, right? And if we just all followed his directions, I don't know. He's like a well-intentioned uncle. I don't know. So become aware. Notice the difference between your inner critic, your inner wisdom, and decide to assume that your inner critic means well and meet it with compassion instead of developing an adversarial relationship with it. And if it's helpful to you, give it a character. What does it sound like? Consider giving it a name when it shows up in your head so you can recognize, most importantly, it's not you. And then thirdly, once you notice your inner critic, I want you to make a conscious choice with how you choose to respond. I want you to not limit your possibility, your beliefs, your thoughts, your dreams, your goals by what your inner critic tells you that you can do or that you can't do. I want you to make the conscious choice. You don't have to have the inner critic leave your mind. The roommate doesn't have to leave the house. It can't realistically, right? You can actually take the roommate with you wherever you go. You can imagine it's like in the car with you, it's along for the ride. We're just not going to let it drive. You definitely don't want to give the keys to the car to Stanley. It's going to end up badly for everybody. So we're going to take the keys back. We're not going to do that. We're going to be driving our own car, our own life, going to make decisions consciously. And so that dialogue with your inner critic might sound like, okay, I hear you. You're trying to keep me safe. There's a part of you that thinks that what I'm about to do is a very bad idea. I know you just don't want me to be hurt. Okay, I've got this. I'm going to do it this way. I know how to take care of myself. I'm going to be all right. Don't worry about me. I'm fine. I have got this. You can peacefully coexist with your inner critic, your roommate. You can let it be there and can still not interfere with your life. It doesn't have to hold you back. It doesn't have to define any decisions that you make. It doesn't have to steer you in any direction. It doesn't have to limit you in any direction. You are the driver of your life and you get to make those choices. And you don't have to listen to that inner critic. And you certainly don't have to take their beliefs to your heart. So in summary, awareness. Notice that it's not you. The voice in your mind is not you. Your inner critic is harsh and loud. Your inner wisdom is soft and gentle. When you notice your inner critic, assume positive intent. Meet it with compassion. And then once you notice that your inner critic is there, just make a conscious choice for how you would like to respond. You get to drive the car, right? Okay, that is what I have for you today. I do have some really exciting things coming up in June. I'm going to be launching another round of my group coaching program, which is going to be set to start sometime in mid-June. Small, intimate group setting. I'm talking like capping the group at 5 or 8 individuals. But if there's enough demand, we can have more than one cohort. So if you've been listening for a while and you just haven't been sure about working with me, this is a chance to get all of this goodness at like a fraction of the cost of my one-on-one program. So go to my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, and get on my email list because that's where all the details for the group coaching will come from. That is what I have for you today. Have a beautiful week, and I'll talk to you soon.